So welcome to the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. My name is Michael Brenson. I'm the artistic director. And we're located in Greenpoint in Brooklyn. And the mission of the foundation is to protect, preserve, and expand the legacy of the sculptor Jonathan Silver. And one of the ways we are now doing this is through an occasional series of conversations at the foundation about individual sculptures by Jonathan. I will invite people in. We will have unscripted conversations that are designed to open up the work, to reveal what the work has to offer, also to welcome other people's responses and anyone who might be interested in exploring the work of this remarkable artist with us. So this is the second conversation that I'm having with the sculptor and writer Bob Taplin. Bob is someone I've known for a long time. Both his work, his interest in narrative, in light, in scale, in all the basic issues of sculpture, and have valued tremendously his knowledge of sculpture, his interest in the history of sculpture, and his sense of figuration. These discussions we've been having about figuration for a long time, and how figuration has worked over the past 30, 40 years, and how it might work going forward, and where the sculpture of Jonathan Silver figures in this larger conversation. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about this work and why I made the choice, and then Bob is going to pipe in, and we're going to see what happens. So this is a plaster head. It was made in 1971. It's unusual in Jonathan's work in that it's really an intact head, and after a certain point, he started to break the head apart and deal with it in a cubistic way, a very experimental cubistic way. But this is an intact, dense, concentrated form that has had a certain kind of purchase on my imagination for as long as I've been aware of it, which is many years now. It was made originally in clay, like all of Jonathan's work, and then he had a plaster cast made of it, and then he started working on the cast, and you could see the carving and the shaping in it from there. It's a tremendously tactile quality to it, and I'm interested in it in its density. I'm interested in this particular kind of concentration. This feels like something that is so sort of compressed that you almost can't compress it anymore. And the previous discussion that Bob and I had about a work by Jonathan, a figure, really raised the issue of energy, and the particular kind of the energy that it has, and maybe the particular capacity that a small head like this, and it's a little bit smaller than a regular head, adult head would be, just to take over a room. Because my sense with this is that no matter where you put it, it's going to be something that people are going to notice, and it's going to command their attention, and it's going to have some kind of real impact on the space around it. I came to this work, I think, in part after studying the early sculpture, the surrealist sculpture of Giacometti, many of which were originally made in plaster. And so I was aware of the kind of tactile, the particular kind of pleasure that one could get out of modeling plaster. And also art historically, I'm aware of his interest in Raymond Duchamp-Villon, who was someone who did heads sort of coming out of, someone coming out of a cubist vein, but we're also dealing with issues of representation and issues of of frontality and what it is to make a head. I mean, this is like a thing that sort of asks me the Giacometti question, like, what is a head? And this is an image of a head, but there's no mouth, there are no eyes, but it is still experienced like fundamentally as a head. And I feel like I'm interested in the geometry of it. You know, this kind of triangle, and then the triangle of the nose, which seems sort of, you know, it does seem like a separate form, and that maybe was jammed up slightly between the eyes, and then the particular way in which another sort of form of a triangle begins to take shape there, and then the ways the other kinds of geometry, you know, begin to form here and in the back. And there's something about this kind of geometry in relation to this head that feels mysterious to me. It's formal on a certain level, you know, obviously, and structural, but there's a way in which this formal and structural investigation of Jonathan begins to become mysterious and almost dreamlike. There are other heads at the studio that just seem like heads, but then the more you look at them, the more you realize, you begin to figure that there's kind of a person here, and maybe there's like the emergence of a person here. I don't know, or something is about to happen. Like we catch this head at a moment where it's already complete, but it's also like curiously maybe on the way to something, and we don't quite know what that is, and it gives it a somewhat mysterious quality to me. And I think it's time really to invite Bob into it, but just to emphasize again that somehow this is a work that's gotten into my dreams, and it exists in a dream space, as well as this tremendously analytical and tremendously material and materialized density.
Yeah, well, I find this head frightening. It's to me, it's kind of gagged and mute and blind. So I feel like it's a head that's trying to get out of a mask of some sort. It's as if its expressive features have been covered, and then it's trying to emerge again somehow out of that shell. The other thing that interests me is the you know, the issue of frontality. The head, anybody who's ever taught people how to do portrait heads discovers that your emotional reading of a head is almost entirely frontal. So when students start making a head, it has a quality of just of a mask in the front. And I used to tell students, well, no, it's more like a fish. It goes back this way. Everything recedes. And the fact that the eyes are frontal, which is this odd thing in terms of mammalian, you know, structure, you know, that's why we all like owls so well, because owls have eyes in the front of their heads too. But really the thing is a sort of a wedge. And so Jonathan has really, he's gone a ways with that, you know, contradiction between the frontality and the recession of the volume of the head. And that's, in the weird way that this nose comes poking out of this wedging form. I mean, it's a strange piece of work, Michael.
What you're talking about, the experience, I mean, a couple of things. The experience of volume. Like, he looked a lot at Egyptian heads, and there are Egyptian heads, they're very frontal, and they have this extension back. Yeah. You know, back, the skull sort of moves back in space. And I think, you know, he felt in part that if you're going to get the volume of the head, the density of the head, that they knew how to do that. And in order to get that, like just this slight, you know, way in which it moves back, there's a little bit of a perspective quality to it, and it definitely makes the head more concentrated and dense. And you know, he was thinking a lot about volume and mass, like these basic sculptural questions that you know, many sculptors are involved with. And I'm intrigued with your sense of it as being muted, or almost that this is a head that's been deprived of the capacity to speak, and is looking for a way to speak, or looking for some way to be able to deliver a language. Because, like, for him, the frontal image, like, you know, Egypt, you know, Greece, Byzantium, Gothic and Romanesque, it's hieratic. Right. And the frontal image was one that was identified with power, with imperial power, with religious power. And I have felt all the way through that what he's doing with the frontality is to try to struggle with the relationship between images of power and diffusing that power, or revealing somehow within that structure of power a kind of vulnerability, so that with all the, I mean, and to me this volume, this density has a tremendous authority to it. But what you're saying too, the strangeness of it and the absence of a mouth, like it can't speak and it can't see.
And
so
can't
what
hear.
It can't hear. So what is the relationship between like the inability that it has to actually communicate, and this tremendous communicative power that's revealed by the materiality of it, and the frontality of it?
Yeah. Well, it's that issue that we were talking about with the other sculpture, is the interior and the interiority and exteriority. You know, Michael Fried had that wonderful thing about theatricality and absorption, right? And his idea was that every portrait is theatrical because it's aware of the viewer. Not this one. Mm-hmm. This one is not aware of the viewer. It's completely interiorized, and so it has what I think Fried would say in its own way, absorption. It's absorbed in its interior world, and that's why it's got this strain, that the volume is so kind of almost explosive. It's like a bomb. It's like
right.
Something that's about to just burst.
But so if we talk about the question of power here, like, I mean, on a certain level, just through the imagery, it's kind of powerless, because it can't speak, can't hear, it can't see. It can't see us, where the power of sight lies with us. But there's still a commensurate power between us and the thing. And in the end, it feels to me, you know, basically that this thing has more power than we do. And even though it's filled with these can'ts, but then there's a way that it can, and I wonder about that. If this kind of sculptural volume is automatically experienced as interiority, like do we assume that, or do we read into this head an interior life because it's so packed? And is that interior life then a psychic life, or is it completely a life of matter? Like sort of almost pre-intelligence, pre-consciousness. Like what is the relationship between consciousness in this figure and unconscious?
Well, I think it's a lot to do with what you talked about at the beginning, right here. This this thing is almost like a target or something. You know, it's all right there, you know, and these volumes that I'm talking about that shelve away from the frontality, those are the sort of realistic, naturalistic aspects of the thing. And it's got an eyebrow ridge, right? But then as we get into this area here, we're in a made-up world. And so, yeah, there's like some strange, like it's like a target. There's some strange focus on this nose and this little area around it that, yeah, again, to me, it's perverse, but it's powerful.
And when you say perverse, can you say more?
Well, it reminds me of, you know, those crazy Nancy Grossman heads with the leather masks on them and stuff that are just, you know, the zippered, you know, and yet, I can relate to what you're talking to. There is, in some weird, there's a certain freedom in there, and I don't know quite what it is.
When you use the word target too, I thought about Jasper Johns,
Yes.
and even wondering,
Right.
you know,
with just the little life cast.
That's right, and on target, you know, on top of the target.
Right. Right. And
Image.
I mean, it's that, you know, the whole objectification of the human form is a modernist trope. It's something that's been sort of worried over for the whole period of modernism.
And what do you mean by objectification here?
Anti-naturalistic, turning the thing. As you say, this has to do with matter, not with flesh. It's not a, you know, it's not a Rodin, it's not a Bernini, it's not a Donatello. There's the power of the thing is as an object, not as a illusion of life.
Do you feel that it's more of an object than a sculpture?
Now, there's a good question. No, it's a sculpture, all right. Yeah, it's a sculpture, all right. Yeah, no, you would never just leave that, you know, sitting on the sideboard next to the decanter of sherry. You know, it's like, and if you did, it would create a ruckus, as you'd say. It's a disturbing piece of work, I think. Well, what about the question of you know, what age is this guy? Right? There's this sort of strange, youthful, old thing to it, right? It's a small head, so you start, you know, a sort of stupid reaction as a child, but then it's got this full jowly back here jaw here that, you know, big here, like he's an old man. And so there's this sort of I mean, it's very hieratic, of course, with that columnar neck and everything, but there's this a floating sense of who he is, or even if it's a he.
I think it would have to be, you know, male by the nature of the skull and you know, the absence of hair and the particular sternness of the image. Yeah, it's true. The age is hard to determine, and unlike a lot of, you know, other images in here where we could kind of begin to figure the age of the people, but I don't know. I would probably say somewhere 30 to 50, like within that range. I don't know younger or older, but that makes me raise the evolutionary question that I was asking, like, is this like is this an image on a form of life on the way from one stage to another stage? I mean, is there like you know, I mean, is there a bit of Neanderthal? Is there something anthropological about the basic nature of the skull and the fact that they're not yet eyes or mouth? So maybe it's not so much that the figure was deprived of them as that it's on the way to them. I'm not sure, and in which case the first thing that would have been stuck in the face, which is a nose, which is odd. But when you ask about the age and the fact that it could be multiple ages, that makes me feel so is there somehow the idea of multiple stages here, of multiple stages of a human being or of a man, man in particular.
It does have an excavated feeling, a sort of, you know, yeah, the feeling of something that got dug up. Yeah, archaic. Although, I don't know, there are fascinating little flickers of expression that go across that face. Especially up in the eyebrow ridge. There are fascinating little flickers of, you know, well, you got your corrugator, your concerned look, and your, you know, no wrinkles in the forehead, but a sort of flickering. You know, it's interesting. There's something where the eyes would be. Maybe it's just you project onto it, but it does sort of flicker a little bit. It doesn't stay fixed. And even now that I'm sort of looking down and where the mouth should be, I kind of see what you're saying. That there's a feeling of something coming into being that hasn't arrived yet.
And there are also these dabs of clay on top of it, would look like clay, although I'm not sure. Maybe it's just wet plaster, particularly on the side that I'm looking at. Like somehow, like he didn't. You know, this is very strict, sort of analytical and rigorous. Like where did he give himself the freedom to make moves that he made more easily in other sculptures and he made later?
Yeah, because this side is carved and this side not so much. Right.
What do you think, one of the questions that I ask myself with a work like this and with a lot of Jonathan's work up to a point is, like, who was he making these for? Because, you know, you can't ever say with an artist they're making it completely for themselves, but was he making something like this to be shown? Was it definitely feels part of an investigation that, like, into heads, into frontality, into volume and mass and the notion of power that that really defined his work, like, all through the 70s. And I never know, it's partly what gives him, I mean, other people might not feel this way, but it's partly what gives it its strength for me. Like, I don't know exactly for whom it's made, and it seems on that level to exist outside of me. Like, it doesn't really, it's not that concerned with what I think about it. You know, it's got its own reason for being. It needs to be in the world in a certain way, but what is that? And is it in fact speaking to the history of art? Maybe, you know, I mentioned Giacometti and Duchamp-Villon, maybe, you know, Rodin too, I'm not sure. But I think these questions about it seem to be important, because with a lot of artists, like, in a way I don't question with Nancy Grossman, like, who is this made for? I kind of know the world that's made for. I know the world it's made to function in, but this seems to be made to function in someplace else, someplace more elusive, someplace outside of where we are now, maybe someplace across time. I don't know. I mean, it makes me feel privileged that the Silver Foundation exists, because we can give something like this a home where it can be seen by other people. And I don't know. I mean, maybe, no, please go ahead.
Well, anybody who was making figurative sculpture in the 70s and 80s was being cussed You know, I mean, I remember being in a panel once and listening to Martin Puryear and Erwin Hauer and Ursula von Röningsvart talking, and I perversely put my hand up and asked the question whether any of them had ever made any figurative sculpture, because Erwin Hauer taught figure sculpture at Yale, and he'd spoken about sort of maintaining the tradition, and so I asked Ursula and Martin whether they'd ever done any figures, and Ursula said, well, there was a moment in the 80s where you would have been alone with your figure. And I said, I remember that moment, and Jonathan does too. There was a contrarian thing. I mean, I'd love to, that's a whole nother conversation I'd love to have about Silver, Mason, Grooms, Neary, you know, this whole crowd there, and then eventually Tucker was a late joiner who took up that sort of contrarian position.
I don't know whether, because this is 71, so Jonathan was still, he had just made a decision to be a sculptor. Like he was still caught through the 60s between, do I want to be a sculptor or do I want to be an art historian? And then at a certain point, and I really think it was right around, if I'm not wrong, right around 1970, he made a decision to give up art history, to stop writing the thesis on Giacometti's painting and devote himself to sculpture. Yeah. And so this is like right at a point, so I think, I don't know to what extent these larger art world questions were still part of the way he was thinking about things. I think, you know, they might have become that, but I think he was still very much immersed in the development of making what he really wanted to make. And I don't know, I mean, so they feel to me, I mean, I don't want to romanticize them because I might be wrong, but they do feel to me part of an inner, this is still part of like an inner dialogue or a dialogue that's not that available or accessible to other people. And I think that there's something about that I find salutary. It also, maybe it enables me to feel like if I had this work in my house, it would be like functioning, you know, in relation to me and in relation to some larger forces that I don't really know what they are, but they're brought into the house and where I live as a result of this. I can feel that he was making this work. Yeah. And that's what really mattered, and that's what took him over, and that's what I'm looking at, like this complete concentration on the problems that were posed by making this particular head, and a complete absorption. It was a moment. I don't think he did this particular kind of head for very long. You know, then we're moving pretty soon after it into the more cubist kinds of heads, but I don't know if I feel that here. You know, that particular moment in modernism and art history, it's harder to locate, and maybe that's a little bit what makes it interesting.
And it was also a set of issues that by 1971 were being shouldered aside pretty heavily.
Like?
Well, I mean, by then, our, you know, Judd and Stella and Paul were in the driver's seat by then.
Right.
And so the whole idea of I mean, yeah, that's that whole other conversation about modernism and postmodernism and whatnot. But yes, I think this stands kind of outside of that.
Right.
Yeah, which is again sort of interesting.
It seems like that stuff was happening. The New York art world was really shaped by you know, minimalism and conceptual art, and you know, happenings and all these things that kind of came at modernism, but broke in certain essential ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, maybe, you know, a last question to you is, since you mentioned in the beginning that it was that there was something really disturbing about the head to you, which is very interesting to me. I wonder, like we've been talking about it for a certain number of minutes now, whether you still feel after our discussion that disturbing aspect of it has the kind of power that it did.
Well, what I'm intrigued with now is that after all our talk about frontality, I'm coming over here and looking at this thing in profile, and I'm seeing this very determined expression. This, you know,
That's what I meant by severe.
kind of,
Yeah.
you know, even up in what would be the eyes and everything, and that's kind of changing my point of view on what it's all about. It has more of a, it's got more of a mug than I thought. You know, he's got, you know, as I said, I was seeing it's almost as if he was gagged, but now I'm not seeing it that way. Certainly not from the side.
But then when you, like I see it too, I can even see like a shape in the mouth. Then I start to think of Gautier-Bresca, you know, and that
sure.
like a different, you know, a very different notion of the human head that was also built into modernism at the same time as Duchamp-Villon was making it. So there was some way in which the head was kind of still coming out of a Cubist moment without actually being that, and maybe taking a step from this head to the more Cubist-like investigation is not that big a step. But if you see the severeness of the expression, then there's a certain amount of anger in it too, a certain judgmental, almost like Old Testament quality
and
to
I'm
it.
still intrigued by this huge jaw. You know, it's just an absolute, you know, yeah. So there's an almost, from the side, there's an almost pugnacious feeling to it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Power.
Yeah. Interesting.
Thank you, Bob.
All right,
Great.
Michael, that's fun.